In the final days of his life, there were no cameras outside the door. No red carpets. No flashing lights. No crowd chanting his name. Somewhere away from the world he helped shape, Roger Allers, the man whose stories once echoed through packed theaters and childhood bedrooms across the globe, was spending his last hours in silence. The irony is impossible to ignore. Millions grew up hearing his work, singing along to his legacy, feeling guided by the worlds he helped create. Yet when his own story reached its final chapter, almost no one knew it was happening. What exactly unfolded in Roger Allers' final hours? Who was with him when the men behind The Lion King reached the end of his life? And how did one of the architects of Disney's golden age quietly disappear while the world he shaped kept moving forward? Tonight, we slow time down. We retrace the final moments of a creative mind that defined a generation, and uncover what his quiet ending reveals about fame, legacy, and the unseen cost of storytelling. The news did not break with urgency. There was no breaking banner crawling across television screens, no emergency alerts lighting up phones. Instead, the confirmation arrived quietly, through industry voices and brief statements that carried a heavy weight between the lines. Roger Allers was gone. For many outside the animation world, the name did not immediately trigger recognition. But within hours, tributes began to surface from filmmakers, animators, and executives who understood exactly what had been lost. Words like visionary, story architect, and creative cornerstone appeared again and again, often paired with a striking observation: the men had shaped one of the most emotionally powerful films in modern animation, yet had chosen a life largely removed from public spectacle. Social media reacted in waves rather than explosions. Fans revisited childhood memories, posting stills from The Lion King, lyrics from songs they had memorized decades earlier, and personal stories of how that film had shaped their sense of courage, loss, and responsibility. Parents wrote about introducing the movie to their own children, unaware until now of the men who had helped give that story its emotional spine. Inside the industry, the reaction was more somber. For those who had worked alongside Allers during Disney's Renaissance years, his death felt like the closing of a chapter that had already been fading into history. Studios had moved on. Technologies had shifted. The hand-drawn era he helped define had long been replaced by digital pipelines and franchise-driven storytelling. And yet, his absence landed with a particular kind of discomfort. Because unlike many figures whose deaths invite immediate retrospectives and carefully curated narratives, Roger Allers left behind a final period that was remarkably opaque. There were no farewell interviews. No public reflections on mortality. No final creative manifesto. Just a quiet end, confirmed after the fact, leaving the public to ask questions that had never been posed while he was alive. How does someone responsible for a cultural milestone exit the world so quietly? Why were the details surrounding his final days so limited? And what does it say about the nature of legacy in an industry that celebrates the work, but often forgets the people behind it? To understand that silence, we have to move backward, away from the moment of his death, and into the life that led him there. Not as a list of credits, but as a sequence of choices, pressures, and turning points that slowly shaped the way Roger Allers would eventually disappear from view. Long before his name was attached to a global phenomenon, Roger Allers was simply a young artist trying to understand how stories worked. He was born into a world far removed from blockbuster premieres and studio politics. As a child, he was drawn not just to drawing, but to narrative, to the way images could suggest emotion, conflict, and meaning without a single word being spoken. Friends and teachers would later recall that he was quiet, observant, and deeply focused, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke. That instinct, to stay behind the curtain, would follow him for the rest of his life. Allers' path into animation was not accidental, but it was not glamorous either. He studied art and filmmaking seriously, immersing himself in classic cinema, European storytelling traditions, and animation as a narrative craft rather than a commercial product. At a time when animation in the United States was still widely dismissed as children's entertainment, Allers saw it as something more enduring, a medium capable of tragedy, moral weight, and emotional truth. His early career placed him inside the machinery of Disney just as the studio was trying to rediscover its soul. The company was emerging from a creative slump, struggling to redefine itself after decades of internal uncertainty. It was an environment thick with pressure, ambition, and unspoken competition. Allers quickly gained a reputation as a storyman. Not the loud visionary pitching ideas in boardrooms, but the one who could diagnose why a scene failed emotionally, why a character's choice didn't land, why an ending felt hollow. He worked on projects like The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast, shaping narrative structure rather than chasing personal recognition. Then came the project that would define his legacy, and, in many ways, complicate it. The Lion King began as an uncertain idea, floating between inspirations, drafts, and tonal confusion. It was not initially expected to become Disney's crown jewel. Many inside the studio believed another film in production at the time would outperform it. That assumption would prove disastrously wrong. As the story evolved, Allers pushed for emotional gravity. He drew from classical tragedy, from Shakespearean themes of loss, guilt, and responsibility. He argued for moments of silence, for consequences that could not be undone, for a young protagonist who did not simply stumble into greatness but was broken before he could grow. The result was a film that struck far deeper than anyone anticipated. When The Lion King was released, its impact was immediate and overwhelming. Audiences returned again and again. Children memorized its lines. Adults found themselves unexpectedly moved by its portrayal of grief and identity. Critics praised its ambition. The box office numbers rewrote industry expectations. And Roger Allers, by most external measures, had arrived. But success inside a system like Disney came with its own shadows. The triumph of The Lion King elevated the studio, not the individual. Credit was shared, diluted, and often absorbed into the brand itself. Allers was respected, but he was not transformed into a celebrity director. He did not become the public face of a franchise. Instead, he remained where he had always been, just outside the spotlight. Over time, subtle shifts began to take place. Creative disagreements emerged. The studio's priorities changed. The hand-drawn tradition that Allers believed in began to feel increasingly vulnerable as technology advanced and corporate strategies hardened. For someone who had poured emotional depth into a film that would outlive him, the transition was disorienting. And quietly, almost imperceptibly, Roger Allers began to step away from the center of the industry that his work had helped revive. In the weeks leading up to his death, Roger Allers was no longer part of the industry's daily rhythm. There were no upcoming premieres bearing his name. No panels, no retrospectives, no public-facing projects signaling a final bow. To the outside world, he had already faded into the background, a figure whose greatest work belonged firmly to the past. What is known about this period comes mostly from absence. There were no social media updates. No late-career interviews. No farewell statements prepared for fans who had grown up with his stories. Unlike many artists whose final years are marked by attempts to reconnect with audiences or reclaim relevance, Allers appeared to have chosen a different path, one defined by privacy. Reports indicate that his health had declined, though specifics were never widely shared. There were no public disclosures of illness, no benefit events, no appeals for understanding. Whatever he was facing, it was handled quietly, away from public scrutiny. For someone who had spent decades shaping stories about responsibility, loss, and acceptance, the restraint felt deliberate. Those close to him later suggested that Allers remained reflective during this time. He was not consumed by unfinished business or public regret. Instead, he seemed to accept his distance from the spotlight as a settled reality rather than a failure. The industry had moved on, and so had he. Still, there were subtle signs that time was narrowing. He was seen less frequently. Communication slowed. Professional conversations that once revolved around potential collaborations faded into silence. The world that had once demanded everything from him no longer asked anything at all. And then, at some point during those final weeks, his condition worsened. Details remained scarce by design, not omission. What can be said with certainty is that Roger Allers' final days unfolded far from the noise of Hollywood, without spectacle, without a public narrative guiding the audience toward closure. Which brings us to the moment that matters most in this story. The final 24 hours. The final 24 hours of Roger Allers' life unfolded without witnesses from the outside world. There were no headlines tracking his movements. No paparazzi images. No countdown that would later be replayed in documentaries. By the time the public learned of his death, the most important moments had already passed in complete quiet. What is known is limited, and that limitation itself becomes part of the story. According to those familiar with the situation, Allers spent his final day in a private setting, removed from professional obligations and public attention. There were no reports of emergency travel, no last-minute hospital transfers made under flashing lights. His final hours did not resemble the dramatic endings often associated with famous figures. Instead, time slowed. The day progressed without announcement. Morning turned into afternoon. Light shifted across the room where he rested. Whatever pain or weakness he was experiencing remained largely unseen, managed within the boundaries of privacy he had maintained for years. There are no confirmed accounts of final phone calls or recorded messages. No documented last words preserved for history. And while that absence may frustrate curiosity, it also reflects something deeply consistent about who Roger Allers was. He never believed that meaning required an audience. What is clear is that his condition reached its end quietly. There was no sudden public emergency, no chaotic rush that spilled into the news cycle. When he passed, it was not in front of the world, but apart from it. The moment itself has not been described in detail. And perhaps it never will be. But the significance lies not in what we can reconstruct minute by minute, but in what the silence reveals. The man who helped millions process grief through storytelling faced his own ending without spectacle. The architect of emotionally charged narratives chose, or was granted, a departure free of narrative framing. When death finally came, it arrived without interruption. And only afterward did the world catch up. News of his passing emerged after the fact, confirmed not by emergency services or breaking news networks, but through professional acknowledgement. A colleague's confirmation. A brief statement. A line of text that carried decades of creative history behind it. Roger Allers was gone. And just like that, the final hours that mattered most were already beyond reach. What followed next was not silence, but reaction. In the days that followed the confirmation of Roger Allers' death, a familiar pattern began to emerge, one that often follows the passing of influential but private figures. People searched for details. What happened? Was there an illness? Were there warning signs? Why did it all feel so sudden, and yet so distant? Journalists looked for official statements. Fans scrolled through archives, interviews, old panel footage, hoping to find clues that might retroactively explain the ending. Industry insiders offered respectful tributes, but few specifics. There was no dramatic investigation to follow, no courtroom battle, no conflicting medical reports to dissect. Instead, there was a vacuum. And vacuums invite interpretation. Some speculated about long-term health issues that had never been publicly acknowledged. Others pointed to the psychological toll of creative displacement, the quiet erosion that can occur when an artist's defining era ends while the work itself refuses to fade. A smaller, more cynical group asked whether the industry that had benefited so profoundly from Allers' contributions had failed to care for him in return. None of these theories came with confirmation. What did become clear was how little the public truly knew about the final chapter of his life. Unlike celebrities whose struggles unfold in real time, Roger Allers had insulated his decline from public consumption. There were no leaked hospital photos. No frantic social media posts. No last-minute appeals for sympathy. That absence was unsettling. Because the world had grown accustomed to witnessing the end of famous lives as a spectacle, documented, analyzed, and endlessly debated. Allers offered no such access. His final hours resisted narrative ownership. And in that resistance, the questions lingered. Was the silence a choice? A form of dignity? Or simply the result of a system that celebrates creation more than creators? The lack of controversy did not diminish the impact of his death. If anything, it sharpened it. The realization that someone so central to modern storytelling could exit without a clear public account forced a confrontation with an uncomfortable truth. Legacy does not guarantee visibility, and influence does not ensure protection from being forgotten in real time. Roger Allers' final mystery was not how he died, but how easily the world had lost sight of him before he did. And that realization reframed everything that came before. When the noise finally settles, what remains of Roger Allers is not a headline, but a feeling. Long after the questions fade, his work continues to live in quiet, persistent ways. In living rooms where parents introduce their children to a story about responsibility and loss. In classrooms where students analyze an animated film that dared to treat grief seriously. In moments when a song begins and an audience, without thinking, sings along. This is the paradox of his legacy. The man who helped millions understand the cycle of life chose a departure that refused spectacle. He did not script his ending for public consumption. He did not frame his death as a final act. Instead, he left behind something far more difficult to measure: emotional truth embedded in art. Looking back from the vantage point of his final hours, Roger Allor's life reads less like a rise and fall narrative and more like a quiet arc. A creator who gave the world a story about facing loss, then faced his own without demanding attention in return. There is no neat lesson here. No moral delivered cleanly at the end. Only an invitation to reconsider how we value the people behind the stories we treasure, and how easily they can slip from view once the spotlight moves on. Roger Allors did not leave the world loudly. But the world is still listening to what he left behind. And in that silence, his final hours continue to echo,